We're in for a real treat. We have a panel discussion with two outstanding speakers who know a great deal about the issue and are very good at teaching to boot. Secretary Condoleeza Rice is the Tad and Diane Toby Director of the Hoover Institution and the Thomas and Barbara Stevenson Senior Fellow on Public Policy. In addition, she's a founding partner of Rice, Hadley, Gates & Manuel LLC, an international strategic consulting firm. From January 2005 to 2009, Condi served as the 66th Secretary of State of the United States and the second woman and first African-American woman to hold the post. She also served as George W. Bush's National Security Advisor from January 2001 to 2005, the first woman to hold that position. Secretary Rice isn't just a statesman and a diplomat. She's also a teacher and a shaper of young minds. She's an award-winning professor at Stanford and co-founded the Center for a New Generation, an innovative after-school academic enrichment program for students in East Palo Alto and East Menlo Park, California. She's joined today by John Meachum, an award-winning historian, writer, and Pulitzer Prize-winning author. John has written many outstanding books, but the one I happen to enjoy most was Destiny and Power, the American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush. John was able to capture not only my dad's story, but he did something even harder to do. He got my dad to talk about himself. Trust me, that was never easy. John is one of the nation's great presidential biographers, having profiled Andrew Jackson, Thomas Jefferson, and Franklin Roosevelt. He is importantly a leading historian of the civil rights struggle, as well as the enduring impact of religion on our nation's founding fathers. These two speakers can help us sort through some of the issues that our country faces today, like how do we rebuild trust in our civic institutions at the federal, state, and local level? How do we increase civic engagement, especially in our democracy? What should civics education look like in the 21st century? And what should it emphasize? And during a time when everything seems to be political, how do we explore difficult but necessary topics that will shape our nation for years to come? Topics like access to the institutions of democracy, the rights of individuals, and the responsibilities we all have to ourselves and our communities. And maybe we can learn from these two historians how great leaders of the past would have addressed our nation at this point in history, in the weeks and months after a divisive, hard-fought presidential campaign. I'd also like to thank veteran, journalist, and civil rights author and documentarian Juan Williams for moderating this important conversation. Okay, enjoy the panel.
Thank you, Governor Bush. All of you, welcome. This is one of the keynote events at EdPalooza, one of the nation's premier education events. This is what we call EdVision because this event is a keynote part of EdPalooza. And for this event, we're going to focus on the importance of democracy and civic engagement as necessary in a complex and changing world for our students to engage. Now let me introduce our guest today. Condi Rice is a former Secretary of State, now chair of the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. Dr. Rice, welcome. I'm going to take the ability here. I have a moment because I know you're calling you Condi. Is that okay?
That's perfect, Juan. I like that.
Okay. And we're also joined by John Meachum, New York Times bestselling author, Pulitzer Prize winner, and historian. John Meachum, thank you so much for making time for EdPalooza.
You cannot call me Condi. Mr. Secretary, I'll take that.
Mr. Secretary, all right, there we go. All right, so I want to begin with Secretary Rice. And John, I'll ask you to follow up with a very simple question, because again, the emphasis on getting young people who are in our schools to engage in democracy, the practice, in civic life. So, Condi, how would you advise our educators to get young people to engage, to pay attention, to feel that they have a role in terms of American civic life?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and thank you to Governor Bush and this great organization for having us to talk about this important subject. I would say, Juan, start them early. I can remember very early on, I think I may have been second or third grade, when we started having little elections in class, when we started following the various events that were going on. These kids are very smart, and these days they have social media, they're constantly engaged with the world. I would say start them early, and start them early in ways that allow them to have a part in it. Tell them early on that democracy is not a spectator sport, and encourage them to find ways that they can be involved. You know, another great way is when they're a little older, through debate. I don't know how many schools any longer do debate societies, but that was one of my introductions into actually making an argument. And that's important because today too many people are willing to just sort of state their opinions as if it were an axiom. That you don't have to defend, that you don't have to mobilize facts for your opinion. I tell my students all the time, just because you think it, it might not be so. And so the earlier that you can get kids to realize that they're going to have to make arguments, I think the better.
That's pretty strong. You know, the thing, John Meachum, is a lot of young people in our schools, they see it as a class, social studies, a history class, but they don't see themselves in the history. One of the things you do so brilliantly is you bring real people to life in your book. So I'm going to ask, what about bringing our real students in America today to life in ongoing history as history is made?
Well, thanks, Juan, and thank you, Madam Secretary. This is about story, right? Homer was right. We don't have to reinvent this wheel. Narrative, narrative, narrative. And I believe that the more we can tell the story of the past as the story of the leaders and the led, leadership and followership, the better we'll be. And I believe in teaching history and civics by case study. Walk through October 1962. If you want to know about high stakes, human factors, people doing the right thing at an hour of maximum danger, as the phrase went, then the Cuban Missile Crisis is a good place to start. You've got this incredibly young American president, I think he was 44 at the time, in the midst of a struggle, an existential struggle with Armageddon at hand. And we have the tapes. You don't have to work very hard here, right? You can multimedia this. Secretary Rice has written brilliantly about Birmingham in the early 1960s. Yeah. If you want to know about why America has a chance of being redeemed, it's because of John Lewis and Diane Nash and Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King and people whose names we don't know. And you can tell the story of, to use the 16th Street Church bombing, which is so close to Secretary Rice's heart. 4 young women died in a struggle between white supremacy and the promise of the Declaration of Independence. You can tell that story of September 1963 and bring issues, the abstractions, into reality, because history is fundamentally a human undertaking.
Could I just follow up on something that John said about, and John, it's Condi, please. We also have known each other for a while. I just want to follow up on something about history, because I think that's just an extremely important point. I'm distressed in my Stanford classrooms these days for how little my students know history. And I will give you a very good example. I taught a course, and this is a college course for juniors and seniors at a very fine university. And I said something about having Khalid Sheikh Mohammed under lock and key during 9/11 would have been like having Rommel under lock and key during World War II. And I got 25 blank stares. And so someplace along the way, we're losing our history. One way that I try to make history interesting for my students, particularly once they're even kind of junior high or high school age, I think you could do this, is through simulation. Allow them to be in that room as the president or the secretary of defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You'd be surprised how much they go and they read about who was Robert Kennedy and how would he have behaved during that period of time. Who was a little known figure in that, Mac Bundy, who it turns out had a major role in this moment in American history. And you can let them role play, and they enjoy it, and they get inspired to learn more. And they learned also sometimes that these decisions are really, really hard. That when you're facing a circumstance with not very good options, it's actually pretty hard to deliver a good decision.
So I was taken by what you said, Condi, with regard to not having preconceived notions, that too often people think that they just have to kind of take what's been baked or told to them by parents or by someone on television, on the radio, as opposed to engaging in the process of learning and civic life. So the question becomes, in this age of social media, is that a problem or is that a help that they will go to sites and locations where people are telling them, this is the way to think, young person?
Well, I always say it's fine to go to sites, but don't just go to the site that reaffirms your high opinion of your own opinion. In other words, find a site that might actually challenge your opinion. And when you find a place that, we all get into our echo chambers, it's very comfortable to be in a place where everything I say, people say amen. If you find yourself in a place that everybody says amen, find another place. And they have other options. Now, the other problem, and I think John would agree with this as a historian, is there is a little bit of a fast food character to the way kids get information these days. So you just Google it. And right away, and look, Google was founded by 2 Stanford grads, so I'm happy, I love Google. But you Google it, it tells you right away what was the date, who were the players, et cetera, et cetera. There's no process of discovery. And I wish we could somehow get our students back into a process of discovery. When we used to go from the time I was 2nd grade to the card catalog at the library, and then you'd find the Dewey Decimal System of classification, and maybe you'd go into the stacks, you'd wander around, you'd see other books. I understand, I'm a curmudgeon, I'm an old person, we're not going back there. But is there some way to re-energize discovery rather than just kind of the fast food delivery of I just Google it and it comes up?
Well, John, as a historian, you are engaged in discovery. What would your advice be on this point, as Condi just raised?
Well, my version of that was, you'd look something up in the encyclopedia, and you would look up Ronald Reagan, and you'd learn about radar, right? I mean, that it was this serendipitous world. Unfortunately, I think the digital world, and I see this with my children, is there are a lot more rabbit holes, and they have a lot to do with the Kardashians as opposed to the communist bloc, which is a better thing to spend time on. I'm a big believer. I'm very old-fashioned on this. I think that you cannot know how to connect dots unless you know the dots. And so the Rommel example is something that I totally share. I've been a big advocate, unsuccessfully, for cultural literacy, the idea that there are things we should know. We should know what Pearl Harbor was. We should know. And in fact, I was thinking about this just the other day. So much of our political language is rich in analogy. And so how can you communicate in a disputatious, big, broad country if a huge chunk of the country doesn't understand the analogies? So George H.W. Bush, during the first Gulf War, came to see the aggression against Kuwait as something akin to Munich. And he could count on a lot of people understanding that when he said it, but fewer today, if a president were to say that. Secretary Rice spent important years in the crucible having to figure out how to talk about foreign policy, security challenges in a way that could be broadly understood. And history helps us in that. So my advice to educators is I think that this is one case where we mentioned Google. I think this is one case where Amazon helps us. Mm-hmm. The best teachers I ever had were the teachers who said, if you liked that, you will like this, right? That algorithm. And I think that a pedagogical use of, if you see any student flicker with interest in something, flood the zone, right? Use the Powell doctrine. Give them a lot of suggestions. Let me tell you a quick story about a teaching moment I had last year at Vanderbilt. It was a class on presidential leadership, and I was giving kind of a standard riff on America as an Enlightenment era project, that we were the political embodiment of the shifts that had begun with Gutenberg through the Reformation, scientific revolution, European Enlightenment, et cetera. And the Declaration of Independence was the fullest manifestation of that. And I had a lot of young left of center students who really came at me and said, no, we don't see America as an enlightened project because of police violence, because of this, because of all the issues we know. And I said, okay, do me a favor. Go read Frederick Douglass's speech at the dedication of the Freedmen's Monument in Washington, which is the greatest meditation on biography I've ever seen. And read William Lloyd Garrison, who wanted to burn the Constitution. And you had Douglass, who wanted to preserve it, William Lloyd Garrison, who wanted to destroy it, and Douglass won, blessedly. And so I gave him this assignment. About 2 weeks later, I made a comment about Thomas Jefferson being inconsistent in his philosophy. And they rose up as if I were being crazy and said, well, don't you understand? History's about imperfect choices. And so I created a room full of Reinhold Niebers. What is interesting about that to me is they were open to reason. They were open to argument. They absorbed the texts. They applied them. And I thought, my work is done here. And if they can do that as citizens, that's great. So that was a case where I sort of tried the Amazon task.
I
like that. That was terrific.
I just wanted to follow up on something John just said, because today we're in a situation in which we believe we seem to believe, in order to teach the history of those who were excluded or dispossessed, we can no longer teach the history of those who were in positions of power. And so you will very often hear, well, I have to talk about the people who were left out of the history. That's absolutely true. I am so glad that we're finally bringing back to life those people who would have been forgotten by the way history was written. But we can't lose sight of the fact that the Jeffersons and the Adams and the Douglasses of the world actually did have a huge impact on where we ended up. And so we can't stop teaching about them as if they didn't matter because we want to teach about the dispossessed. And somehow we have to get the whole narrative. We've had part of the narrative of the elites of the period. Now let's not make the mistake and say we'll no longer teach the narrative of the elites. We'll only teach the narrative of those who were left out. The entire narrative includes both. One of the most beautiful exhibits I think I've ever seen, one of the most compelling exhibits, is in the National Museum of African American History, which is just a spectacular place. I mean, what Lonnie Bunch and his colleagues did there is just amazing. But there is this huge bronze of Jefferson. Maybe it's, 8, 9, 10 feet high. And beneath him are bricks with the names of his slaves. And it absolutely makes this point that he went, and in front of him is, of course, all men are created equal. It makes the point of this imperfect character in our history who was contradictory in his views, contradictory in his life, but who left this extraordinary extraordinary way of moving forward, this kind of canvas on which we would write a new history as we moved forward. And that very Constitution would eventually become the one that Thurgood Marshall and others appeal to bring the descendants of those very slaves rights. That's a complex story, and increasingly America's story, John, as you were just explaining, is taught in too simple a fashion.
Well, this is something where I think the two of you have some synergy, if you will, or, complementary thoughts. Because, John, you have had a voice with regard to a contemporary controversy dealing with the monuments that we have to history.
Yeah.
And the effort by some to remove monument statues that honor Confederate generals. And you've made a distinction between people like Jefferson and those Confederate leaders. Maybe you could lay it out here, but I think I would ask you to lay it out in a way that would help educators, help policymakers understand how to use contemporary controversy to engage young people, students, in civic life.
Absolutely. And that's one of the great utilities of history, right? Is that it does speak to our time. It's not a GPS system, but it is a diagnostic guide, right? There are certain symptoms that recur that suggest treatments are wise treatments. My doctrine on this, which has been wildly unsuccessful, but I'll try it again here, is I call it the imperfect union test, which is if you were devoted to the constitutional experiment to create a more perfect union, then there is a place, given the totality of all of their circumstances, there is a place in the public square to memorialize and commemorate those figures, even though they weren't perfect. And by the way, if we're looking for perfect people, there will be no monuments. So that's one thing. If you were devoted to destroying that experiment, to ending the constitutional experiment that led to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and into the country we are, then you should not be on public land. I'm not going to speak to private land or your yard or schools. Those are decisions for those institutions. But our land, our courthouse squares, if you were a Confederate officer, you were trying to end that experiment. And I don't think that's appropriate. And in terms of the news and what's happening now being a tool, I think it's the best tool. At least it is for me in a classroom. It's, okay, this is going on. How is this different, or how is this similar to what's gone on in the past?
I couldn't agree more with the separation here. Every day when I was Secretary of State, I would walk down a hallway, which is called Mahogany Row, on the way to the Secretary's office. And the Secretaries of State of the early 19th century, like Jefferson and Madison and Monroe and others, are up on the 8th floor and the 7th floor. And then the contemporary secretaries are actually not too far away. But on my floor, my quarter, there were the later 19th century. I had to pass by a portrait of John C. Calhoun every day. And I thought to myself, why is he here? He tried to destroy the Union. Mm. And I think that the notion that we should have monuments to people who tried to destroy the Union strikes me as bizarre. But monuments to those who, as John said, built that less than perfect Union, clearly allowed the birth defect of slavery to exist for 100 years, I think we still have to recognize what they did. And I would say one other thing. We also know that some of those Confederate monuments were actually placed after the fact. Oh. And they were placed there because people wanted to make sure that Reconstruction was actually not going to lead to equality for the descendants of slaves. And since I grew up in Jim Crow, Alabama, and grew up in a place where you couldn't go to a movie theater, you couldn't go to a restaurant, that commemoration I don't want to see.
Condi, let's stick with you for a second here, because in your book, Democracy, Stories from the Long Road to Freedom, you talk about what you call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: populism, nativism, isolationism, and protectionism. And as I'm hearing the two of you say, yeah, we can use current events, I think about the rise of populism, the rise of nationalism, the rise of isolationism, the rise of protectionism in our current day, and appeals to young people that might be stultifying. It might say to them, no, don't engage, just adapt to this ideology. How do you protect against those four horsemen that you've laid out?
Well, the first thing, to go back to history, is to remind people it didn't work out so well the last time around. Right? So where did our modern international system really come from after World War II? It came from people who knew the history of the period between World War I and World War II, where the rise of populism, where the rise of nativism, where the rise of isolationism and protectionism led ultimately to a Great Depression and to another Great War. And what they said in 1945 is, we're not going to repeat that mistake. This time, we're going to have an international economy that is not zero-sum game, like the one between World War I and World War II, where we had violent competition over resources, where we had manipulation of currencies, where we had beggar thy neighbor trading policies. And they said, this time around, we're going to build an international economy that is positive sum. And it will mean that nations will trade more freely, and it will mean that economies will be more open, and it will mean that people may be able to move more freely. And so actually, when I teach about the rise of the four horsemen now, I do go back to what was the reaction to them by the people who created the post-World War II system. Now, I will be the first to say it hasn't worked out perfectly for everyone. And one of the things that elites who have enjoyed globalization, for whom, look, we're global elites. We move around the world easily. I always say I have the paradigmatic student at Stanford, born in the graduate school of business, born in Brazil, went to college at Oxford. First job was in Shanghai. Now in Palo Alto for an MBA, and next job will be in Dubai. Moves easily around the world. But actually, most people never live more than 25 miles from where they were born. Their aspirations are different, their opportunities are different, and they got left behind by globalization. And I don't care how many times you tell them, globalization, Mr. Unemployed Coal Miner, was good for you. Or Mr. Unemployed Steelworker in Britain, it was good for you. That's why populism is on the rise. But so you remind people that historically it didn't work out very well the last time around. But you remember, too, that unless you do something in terms of skills development, in terms of a future for people for whom it didn't work, populists are going to continue to have their say.
So, John, does that come across as preachy as opposed to educational? It sounds almost like you're saying, here's why it didn't work last time, don't do it. But for the teachers, the policymakers who are listening in to our event today, what would you say? How would you cast Condi's point?
I agree with it. And I think that, again, case study, right? So 100 years ago, exactly, let's do 101 years ago. Here's what was going on in the world. We were in the midst of a pandemic that killed 675,000 Americans. We were beginning a period of isolationism with the failure of the League of Nations after the First World War. We had an American president who had resegregated the federal government and cracked down on civil dissent to such an extent that it created, under Felix Frankfurter, the American Civil Liberties Union as a response to the raids that were authorized by an attorney general who cracked down. The Ku Klux Klan had been refounded in 1915. My native region, Condi's native region, was thoroughly defined by apartheid, and the women were disenfranchised 101 years ago. This is just the 100th year of women having the right to vote. You know, that's not great, right? And all the forces that Condi mentions that were shaping us then are shaping us now. My argument about the country is that these are perennial forces. Racism, xenophobia, nativism, extremism, isolationism, they ebb and they flow. And what you want to study, it seems to me, and this would be my answer to what Condi's saying, is you want to study moments where they ebbed and where they flowed, and compare and contrast those and try to figure out what made those eras different one from another, and what are the lessons we can learn from it. Condi's colleague Neil Ferguson and Graham Allison at Harvard are advocates of something called applied history, where you study the past with an eye toward what are the examples that can guide us today. I think that's the question. And I think the good news for teachers is that you've got nothing but the whole sum of human experience at your fingertips. If you want to do the Trojan horse about the March of Folly and making stupid mistakes, you can do that. If you want to talk about racism, you can do enslavement, or you can do Jim Crow, or you can do South Africa. There are just the whole panoply of the human experience is at our hands, and narrative is our friend. Tell the story. And I find I learn things when I hear stories.
Yeah.
You know, there's science, there's some neuroscience about this. And so I would just engage as much as possible, find a couple of characters. You know, you want to tell the story of race in modern America to some extent, you could do a lot worse than doing Bull Connor versus Martin Luther King with a strong cameo from John Kennedy, who was more conflicted about it, right? That sort of gives you the moment.
Yeah.
And so tell the story.
Condi, you wanted to jump in?
I would just give, I think that's absolutely brilliant. You tell the story. I called my book Democracy Stories from the Long Road to Freedom because I think stories really do help. And I would just add another kind of story. So you mentioned Bull Connor. Little girls growing up in Birmingham, Alabama. They go to swim camp when she's 4 years old. The next summer, her mother says, well, we're not going to be able to swim this summer. Well, why aren't we going to be able to swim, Mommy? Well, they've closed the pools. Bull Connor has closed the pools rather than integrate them for whites and blacks. And so this little girl doesn't learn to swim till she's 25 years old and moves to California because Bull Connor closed the pools. I think also the stories of ordinary people under these circumstances that are these great historical forces also help to make the point. I wanted to make one other point about applied history. But
wait a second, hold on. But that's you. That's you.
That girl's me. That little girl.
You didn't tell us that. I just think everybody should know.
That's right. But she became Secretary of State, so it worked out in the end.
But that's it. That's America.
Yeah, that's America. Yeah. That's America. I wanted to use one other contemporary issue that we have and talk about history, and that's the issue of the fight for racial justice that's been so much in our minds after the tragic murder of George Floyd. And so what did we learn about progress in the 50s and 60s? It actually goes all the way back to the 30s and 40s, actually. We learned that the protests were extraordinarily important. So I grew up in Birmingham during Kelly Ingram Park and Bull Connor's police dogs going after peaceful demonstrators. We had John Lewis and the various marches and Selma and so forth. So the protests were critical. But so too was a legislative agenda brought really by a Southerner, Lyndon Johnson, who managed to get this historic legislation passed. But we also know that years before that, the courts were being used by Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP and others, the Margot Report, which is written in the 30s, about how to bring cases in the courts that would break down Jim Crow. And they won some and they lost some. So here we have a story of the power of the people, which we're seeing in the streets in the George Floyd situation. But also, they didn't stop there. Protests weren't enough. They had a legislative agenda. They had an agenda for the courts. It says use the institutions that are available to you. And I think that helps people to understand. And then there's even an ordinary citizen part of that. So again, this little girl growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, one Christmas, her parents say, you know, we're not going to be able to shop in the stores this Christmas. Why, Mommy and Daddy? Because those stores won't hire Negroes, as we call them in the days. And so we're boycotting. And so we boycott the stores. People also involved. And so I think you can go back to history and see what was a successful strategy for moving the South forward And what does that tell us today about a successful strategy for the next chapter in racial equality?
Yeah, I had an experience like that this summer, because I was in one of those protests with my grandchildren. And so to see granddaughters who are kind of puzzled about why they're going, why do those men, the policemen, have those big guns? Is this safe? That was their principal perception. But then to talk with them, to engage with them about the larger issue, and even the possibility of change, that there is a legislative agenda, there is a political policy agenda that their parents will pursue, and one day that they can, in a democracy, raise their voices in the public square, not just through protests, but by contributing to the larger debate. I think that was for me, even as the grandfather, not the grandchild, it was educational. Let me ask the two of you to specifically address education. It was 30 years ago that then President George H.W. Bush convened a meeting of all the nation's governors to talk about education, the state of education. How can we do a better job of educating our nation's children? Let me begin with you, John, on this one. Where have we come? Where do you think, as a historian, we need to go to improve the quality of our schools?
Education's the engine of citizenship, and it's arguably the engine of democracy as well. This is an ancient insight. It's Jeffersonian as well, that without an educated citizenry, a republic fails. And the meeting was at Williamsburg, I think, and Bush was impressed with this young guy from Arkansas named Bill Clinton. So that was kind of the beginning of the end in some ways. I think one of the things I think that George W. Bush should be proudest of is an attempt to do big bipartisan education reform. It was the first thing he wanted to do out of the box. It was what he wanted to do as governor of Texas, one of the pillars there. And I mention it because we think of education sometimes as this sort of liberal and democratic issue, but it's an American issue. And without a concentrated focus on how we prepare citizens, we've seen over the last 5 years how tenuous and perilous the American experiment is. And that's not going to end. No single election changes that, no single piece of legislation. And I think that so there's a vast policy question, but my final point is just a word of thanks to everybody who's part of this project. This is about teachers. This is about human beings. I heard a phrase once about 1,000 points of light, and that's not just volunteerism. It's also acts of grace and citizenship and the hard, constant work of actually lifting up each student.
Condi Rice, where do you think we've come on the education front over that period of the last 30 years?
I'm not sure that we haven't gone backwards, especially for our poorest kids, the kids who need it most. And that, to me, is a very sad state of affairs. Look, my family cares deeply about education. I'm not even the first PhD in my family. Why? Because my grandfather decided he was going to get a college education in 1919. And so education's just at the heart of what we do. And I always said my parents never expected me to grow up in a society without prejudice. They didn't. And so they believed education was a kind of armor for me. And I now look at the poorest of our kids, and I just want to say to all the teachers out there, thank you, thank you, thank you for what you do. It is hard work. My mother was a teacher. It is really hard work. We've got to do better in the support for the people who want to do the hard work. You can't have low expectations for your kids. President George W. Bush also said the bigotry of the soft bigotry of low expectations. You got to have high expectations for the kids. You have to have high expectations for the teachers. You have to reward great teaching. We know that the principal can make a huge difference. So the training and cultivation of good principles is really important. And I'll say something that I think is maybe controversial in some places. I actually think poor parents have to have better choices. You know, when people say to me, school choice is a problem for the public schools, charters or vouchers or whatever, the truth of the matter is we have a choice system. If I I will move to a district where the schools are good and the houses are expensive. That's a choice. And my kids will grow up in great public schools. If I'm really wealthy, I'll send my kids to private schools and they will be just fine. And who's stuck in failing neighborhood schools? Poor kids. And that's the civil rights issue of our time. If those parents can be given better choices, then maybe those kids also get out. And I have to say, it just makes my blood boil when I hear people say that vouchers or charter schools, it's not good for public education. I'm a huge defender of public education. But while we are making the repairs, let's give those poor parents a choice. Because, if you want to write the editorial that says, we shouldn't have school choice, we shouldn't have charters, not all charters are good, I understand that, but we shouldn't have that, then send your kids to school in Anacostia. Don't send your kids to Sidwell Friends and write that editorial. And so I think we have very strong problem with inequality in our schools right now. And I'm going to tell you, I think COVID has made it worse. I think about the learning loss for kids who don't have parents at home, who could engage in remote learning that was inspiring and innovative because they themselves were educated. What about the kid who the parent doesn't even speak English? How'd that kid do under remote learning? And oh, by the way, I heard a person from a southern state say recently, 40% of their citizens don't have access to broadband. That's like not having access to electricity today. So we have a national project, which is to find a way for everybody to have an opportunity for that high quality education.
I think that's an important point because it's so obvious in this age of COVID. One of the things that strikes me as you were speaking about your controversial point about options and alternatives is that even as we go about improving the quality of schools, if you're being left behind at this point and it takes us 5 or 10 years, that's a lifetime for a child. And it really sets that child back for their lifetime. And that's why I think alternatives, choices are so important at this juncture. John Meachum, Condi Rice, I want to say thank you for joining us today. This has just been first-rate fabulous, and I hope that the teachers, the educators, the policymakers have found this event and your opinions to be valuable. It's been an honor for me to participate. Governor Bush, please take over.